One little signature can change the fate of millions.
One signature.
One quick
can
nod
shake
at the
an
wrong
entire
moment can
nation.
set an entire country on fire. And trust me, American history is jam-packed with moments just like that. Today, we're cracking open the White House's
When
failed
fear
files,
rules the
scoring
room,
some of the biggest
reason
presidential
disappears.
screw-ups in U.S. history on 4 brutal scales: law, lives,
decision in the
economy,
White
and public
House
trust.
echoes in the
And this
streets.
isn't just story time. No, I've got the
One
receipts,
economic
straight from the
misstep,
National
and the
Archives,
market crumbles.
declassified files, the whole deal. So nobody can say, nah, you're just making
always
this up.
the soldiers who pay
Oh
the
no,
price.
these are real, and some of them are such jaw-droppers you'll find yourself asking, wait, this guy was running a superpower.
Behind closed
So let's
doors,
kick things off with
history
America's
takes
second
its darkest
president,
turns.
John Adams. The man who was supposed to defend
From
free
Adams to
speech,
Bush,
and
the
instead
receipts
became the
don't
very
lie.
first guy to put it in a chokehold. If we're gonna pick someone to christen the White House, fail file, step right up. John Adams, America's second president. Here's the backdrop. The U.S. had just signed a peace treaty with Britain, which made France absolutely furious. The papers went wild with rumors, French spies everywhere, foreign agents hiding in plain sight. The public panicked, politicians freaked out, and right in the middle of it all was John Adams, a founding father, a guy who literally helped write the rules of the Republic. You'd think he'd stand tall and defend free speech, right? No,
suggest what I
Adams
see as
basically said, nope, can't handle it, and signed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And what did those laws say? Brace yourself.
Okay, my love.
If you're an immigrant the government doesn't like, right arrow, boom, deported. If you criticize the government, right arrow, congrats, you're going to jail. So yeah, just 20 years after America fought a revolution to protect liberty and free speech, one of the founding fathers
the
was
Gazette.
like,
Read it for
delete
yourselves."
button, please. The fallout was brutal. Newspapers rebelled, the public was outraged, and Thomas Jefferson rode that wave of anger straight into the White House in 1800. Adams, he got booted. And the
We are on
Alien
the
and Sedition
precipice of a
Acts
decision
became exhibit in
that
the
will
eternal
forever
lesson.
shape
The
the
more
destiny
scared
of
a
this young
government
nation.
gets, the smaller your freedoms become. But don't think this was just a one-off oopsie. Adams set a dangerous precedent that in times of crisis, presidents could crown themselves mini-kings and put civil liberties on pause. And sadly, that playbook didn't end in 1798. It popped back up in the Civil War, the World Wars, even in the War on Terror. In other words, John Adams, the guy who helped lay the foundation for American freedom, was also the first one to hit the mute button on it. A true facepalm moment in presidential history. And if Adams managed to strangle free speech,
Please, we are
his
refugees.
successor, Thomas Jefferson, pulled off something even wilder, strangling the entire U.S. economy. Let's talk about how Jefferson's genius trade plan backfired on a global scale. After John Adams basically hit the mute button on free speech, you'd think his successor, Thomas Jefferson, would step in and clean up the image of the presidency. No. Jefferson gave America one of the most classic shoot-yourself-in-the-foot moments in U.S. history. Here's the scene. Early 1800s, Europe is on fire with the Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France hate each other's guts, but somehow they both agree on one thing: bullying America. U.S. merchant ships get stopped, cargo seized, and American sailors literally kidnapped to serve on British ships. Basically, Uncle Sam looked like the scrawny kid on the block, and the big bullies kept stealing his lunch money. Jefferson, a man famous for hating war, decides he's going to outsmart them. His big brain move? The Embargo Act of 1807. He shuts down all American trade with the outside world. The logic in his head: if I don't sell them anything, they'll come crawling back begging me to reopen trade.
Believe it.
Boom,
Same
checkmate.
old story, really.
Reality check. Britain and France barely even noticed.
What a
Meanwhile,
joke.
back home, U.S. ports turned into ghost towns.
We have no
30,000
choice. It is
sailors
the
out of
law.
work, farmers watching crop prices
is no
tank,
other
and
option. It is
smuggling
what it is.
exploded like fireworks on the 4th of July. New England's economy wrecked. People were so mad they nicknamed the law the Oh Grab Me Act, which, fun fact, is embargo spelled backwards. That's some 19th century meme energy right there. After 15 miserable months, Congress finally pulled the plug. America got nothing out of it except a trashed economy and one more reason to stumble into the War of 1812. If Adams made people wonder, hey, whatever happened to free speech? Then Jefferson had folks asking, wait, why is our president locking up our own marketplace? The lesson? Sometimes the fear of conflict can drive a nation straight into a bigger disaster than the conflict itself. And speaking of disasters, if Jefferson merely tanked the economy, Andrew Jackson went much further, turning a Supreme Court decision into a joke and sending thousands of Native Americans on a deadly journey history remembers as the Trail of Tears. So Adams muzzled free speech, Jefferson padlocked the economy, and then along came Andrew Jackson, who pulled off something even darker. He turned a Supreme Court ruling into scrap paper and opened the door to one of America's most tragic chapters, the Trail of Tears. Here's the setup. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. On paper, it said native nations, like the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole would exchange their homelands in the southeast for new land out west, what's now Oklahoma. Supposedly, they'd get peace and protection. In reality, it was relocation at gunpoint. Fast forward to 1832, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee had the right to stay on their land. Victory, right? Cue the confetti. Nope. Jackson basically shrugged. He's often quoted, maybe apocryphally, as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Translation, cute ruling, I'm ignoring it. And just like that, the highest court in the land was reduced to background noise. What followed was forced marches of entire communities, men, women, children, driven hundreds of miles through brutal weather. For the Cherokee alone, about 4,000 people died from disease, hunger, and exposure. That's not relocation. That's a humanitarian disaster. But the fallout didn't end there. Once native lands were cleared, cotton plantations spread like wildfire, and cotton meant slaves. Jackson's policy didn't just destroy native nations, it supercharged the South's slave economy, laying fresh kindling for the Civil War a few decades later. Sure, Jackson is still remembered by some as the champion of the common man, but history has to add a big asterisk. Common man unless you were native. For those forced down the Trail of Tears, he wasn't a hero, he was the author of their nightmare. And if Jackson treated the Supreme Court like a joke, then just a few decades later, America got a president who basically did nothing while the nation slid into flames of secession. Meet James Buchanan, the ultimate park bench sitter of the White House. After Andrew Jackson treated the Supreme Court like scratch paper, America rolled straight into another disaster. A president who decided not to decide anything at all. Enter James Buchanan, the 15th president, better known by historians as the guy who kept the chair warm for the Civil War. Here's the setup. It's 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins the election. Down south, panic spreads like wildfire. People are terrified Lincoln will block the spread of slavery, and southern states start shaking like leaves in a storm. Then, boom, secession begins.
Did you see this?
South Carolina bolts in December 1860. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow. Within months, huge chunks of the map flipped color. All eyes turned to the White House. The country was literally falling apart. What would the president do? And Buchanan basically said, well, secession is illegal, but I don't actually have the power to stop it. And that was it. A presidential shrug at the edge of disaster. While Buchanan sat around drafting messages, the South was busy, seizing forts, stockpiling weapons, drilling soldiers. By the time Lincoln finally walked into office in March 1861, 7 states had already left the Union and the Confederate flag was waving proudly. The result, the Civil War. 4 bloody years, over 600,000 dead, cities burned, families torn apart. And Buchanan, he sits in the history books with the world's worst job title. The guy who failed hardest when the country needed leadership most. If you want an analogy, Buchanan was like a security guard watching a burglar walk into your house with a knife and saying, "Well, robbery is technically illegal, but hey, not my problem." And after a president who let the country burn, America finally clawed its way to peace after World War I. But then came another blunder, Woodrow Wilson, who fumbled the chance to build lasting peace, all because of his political ego. After James Buchanan sat back and watched the nation burn into civil war, let's fast forward to the early 20th century. World War I has just ended.
Gentlemen,
the guns are finally silent. Europe looks like a construction site after a tornado. Out of the rubble steps Woodrow Wilson with what sounds like a world-saving idea, the League of Nations.
We are at the Palace of
This was
Versailles
Wilson's
to discuss
passion
the
project,
pressing matters
his
of our
baby.
time.
He believed if countries just sat at the same table and promised to defend each other, that's Article 10, the world would never plunge into another global war. Sounds noble, right? Only one problem: Wilson forgot to check if the American people, or more importantly, the U.S. Senate, were actually on board. Back home, the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, basically said, "Sure, we'll sign on, but we need some edits. Article 10 can't drag America into wars without Congress approving it." Honestly, pretty reasonable, but Wilson, stubborn as a brick wall, his answer, "No edits, take it or leave it." So the Senate left it. Boom, America, the very country that dreamed up the League, never joined it. The fallout: the League of Nations turned into an international book club without its biggest member. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, when Germany rearmed, what did the League do? Wagged its finger. That's it, a paper tiger. And less than 20 years later, the world spiraled into an even bloodier conflict, World War II. Wilson wanted to be remembered as the architect of peace. Instead, his stubbornness turned that dream into a bitter punchline. As one historian quipped, "Wilson won in Paris but lost in Washington." And if Wilson flopped because of an ego too big to bend, just a decade later America got another president who flopped
Senate
because of an
treaty.
economic plan
US
so bad it
refuses
tanked
to
the whole
join
country. Enter Herbert Hoover and his famous Smoot Hawley Tariff, also known as the highest wall that made the economy fall. If Wilson tanked because of a stubborn ego, the next entry in our presidential fail file belongs to Herbert Hoover, a man who managed to turn a bad recession into the Great Depression with one colossal misstep. Here's the backdrop: 1929. The stock market crashes like a Jenga tower. Banks are folding left and right. Unemployment is soaring. Americans are panicking, and the whole world is tumbling after. Enter Hoover, a successful engineer who believed deeply in self-reliance. His plan to save the economy: sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. This law slapped the highest import taxes in U.S. history. The logic: if we make foreign goods crazy expensive, Americans will buy local and our industries will bounce back. Sounds kinda reasonable on paper. In practice, a dumpster fire. Other countries weren't just gonna sit there and eat the loss. They retaliated with tariffs of their own. Global trade, already on life support, flatlined. U.S. exports plunged more than 60%. Farmers couldn't sell crops, workers lost jobs, businesses shuttered. It was the economic equivalent of aiming at your enemy and shooting yourself in the foot. Twice. Meanwhile, Hoover clung to his philosophy that the federal government shouldn't hand out direct relief, that charities and local governments could handle it. The problem: local governments were broke, charities were overwhelmed, and people were starving. Shantytowns popped up across the nation, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles. The result: instead of saving the economy, Smoot-Hawley became a monument to short-sightedness. It seared one lesson into America's political DNA. In a crisis, the federal government can't just sit back, it has to act. A principle that still shapes U.S. policy today. If we're grading presidential fails, Hoover's only bonus point is that he left us with the perfect cautionary tale. Don't ever try that again. And if Hoover built a tariff wall that crushed the economy, then Franklin D. Roosevelt went even further. He built barbed wire fences to lock up American citizens. one of the darkest stains of the 20th century. Executive Order 9066 and the Japanese-American internment camps. If Hoover wrecked the economy with a tariff wall, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, went one step further. He built barbed wire fences and locked up American citizens. And that's not just a fail, it's one of the ugliest scars on 20th century America. Here's the backdrop. December 1941. Pearl Harbor gets bombed. The U.S. reels in shock, and fear spreads faster than gossip at a small-town diner. Whispers of Japanese spies and sabotage go viral long before Twitter was a thing. And in that climate of paranoia, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. On paper, the order allowed the military to remove anyone from sensitive zones. In practice, it meant Japanese Americans. About 120,000 people, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were forced from their homes, farms, and businesses and sent to remote internment camps.
We are engaged
no trials,
in a great
no charges.
national effort.
Their only crime was their ancestry. Inside the camps, families lived in drafty barracks, choking on dust storms in the desert, sweating in the heat, freezing in the cold. Kids went to makeshift schools, elders died behind fences, communities lost everything they'd built. The Supreme Court, in one of its most infamous moments, upheld the policy in Korematsu v. United States, 1944. Only later, in ex parte endo, did the court finally rule that loyal citizens couldn't be detained. By then, the damage was done. Thousands of lives upended, trust in government shattered. FDR is rightly praised as the man who beat the Great Depression and led America through World War II. But his record carries a painful footnote. The president who told Americans, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," and then let fear call the shots. And if FDR locked up his own people out of fear, then 2 decades later, another president, young, charismatic John F. Kennedy, nearly scared the world into nuclear war, all thanks to a fiasco called the Bay of Pigs. If FDR locked up Americans out of fear, then John F. Kennedy, young, handsome, and smooth-talking like a Hollywood star, delivered a different kind of historical faceplant, the Bay of Pigs. And this fail was so big the whole world sat back with popcorn to watch America embarrass itself. Here's the setup. It's 1961. JFK's only been in office a few months when the CIA shows up with what they swear is a genius plan. We'll use Cuban exiles to invade the island and overthrow Fidel Castro. Quick, easy, and best of all, totally deniable. Sounds like an ad for overnight shipping. Kennedy was intrigued but cautious. He worried about leaving fingerprints, so he cut back U.S. air support. The CIA still promised, "Relax, Mr. President. This plan is safer than drinking a glass of milk." Reality, the moment those exiles hit the beach at the Bay of Pigs, Castro's forces were waiting. No air cover, no reinforcements. After 3 days of desperate fighting, most were captured or killed. On the world stage, it was an epic public humiliation. Castro laughed, the Soviets cheered, and Cuba ran straight into Moscow's arms, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis just a year later. JFK was furious, feeling duped by the CIA's sales pitch of a sure thing. But that sting also toughened him up. When the missile crisis hit in 1962, Kennedy kept a cool head and steered the world away from nuclear war. If we're grading fails, Bay of Pigs is the one where America tried to play superpower and instead tripped flat on its face on a tiny Caribbean beach.
I hear you.
A blunder that left Kennedy red-faced and force-fed him a brutal lesson. Never trust a plan that sounds too perfect. And if JFK only lost big over 3 days, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, dragged America into a war that lasted a decade, costing 58,000 American lives. And it all started with one foggy night in the Gulf of Tonkin. If JFK only lost face over 3 days at the Bay of Pigs, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, dragged America into a war that lasted a decade. And the tragedy all started on one foggy night in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. Here's the setup. After Kennedy's assassination, Johnson steps in with his big dream of the Great Society.
There it is again.
A fair, prosperous America. But halfway around the globe, Vietnam is already on fire. Johnson dreaded being the president who lost Vietnam to communism, so he just needed the right excuse to ramp things up. That excuse came in August 1964. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox clashed with North Vietnamese patrol boats. Then on the night of August 4th, radar reports came in claiming there was another attack. Hot news hit Washington. Johnson jumped at the chance. He declared the U.S. had been attacked a second time and asked Congress for a blank check, full military powers. Congress signed off, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution swung the door wide open to full-scale war. The problem, that second attack on August 4th never actually happened. Later, declassified NSA files admitted it was radar confusion, wave echoes, and plain old fear. In other words, America marched into a massive war based on a ghost on a sonar screen. The cost: over 58,000 American soldiers dead, millions of Vietnamese lives lost, and U.S. society ripped apart. Protests erupted coast to coast, trust in government bottomed out, and the nation was left bitterly divided. LBJ had hoped his legacy would be the Great Society. Instead, history remembers him for the quagmire of Vietnam. As one historian put it, LBJ won the war on poverty at home, but lost to phantoms at sea. And if Johnson got stuck in Vietnam, the next president, Richard Nixon, managed to dig his own grave right in Washington, all because he thought covering up a crime was easier than owning it. Hello, Watergate. If Lyndon Johnson bogged America down in Vietnam, Richard Nixon, the man who followed him, dug his own grave right in Washington. And it all started with a good old-fashioned break-in. June 1972, 5 guys sneak into the Democratic National Committee's office at the Watergate complex. At first, it sounded like some clumsy burglary. But nope, these guys were linked directly to Nixon's re-election campaign.
We need to ensure complete
now
discretion
Nixon could
on
have
this
owned
matter.
it. Fired people, cut his losses. Instead, he went full-tilt cover-up. Hush money changed hands. The CIA was dragged in to lean on the FBI. Nixon thought he was slick enough to control the whole show. But like Grandma always said, that dog won't hunt. 2 years later, when the White House tapes came out, especially the smoking gun tape from June 23, 1972, it was Nixon's own voice proving he'd been in on the cover-up from day one. Congress prepped impeachment. The public was furious. And Nixon became the first, and so far only, U.S. president to resign in August 1974. But the fallout wasn't just one man's career going up in smoke. Public trust in the presidency, already shaky after Vietnam, hit rock bottom. Ever since, any political scandal gets branded with that famous suffix, gate. As one wag put it, Nixon's lasting legacy was turning a deep sea, a hotel into the most overused punchline in American politics. And if Nixon collapsed under a cover-up, 3 decades later, another president would plunge America into war over weapons that didn't even exist. Ladies and gentlemen, George W. Bush and the Iraq War, brought to you by the ghost of WMDs. If Nixon torpedoed his career with a cover-up, George W. Bush managed to drag America into a whole war over something that didn't even exist, weapons of mass destruction. Picture the mood, post-9/11 America, raw with grief and fear. People wanted action. Congress was ready to flex, and Bush's administration insisted Saddam Hussein was stockpiling chemical and nuclear weapons. The pitch was simple. If we don't hit him first, you'll regret it later.
By tragedy.
Millions of Americans bought it. March 2003, the U.S. and its allies rolled into Iraq. Baghdad fell fast, Saddam's statue came crashing down, and everyone thought, well, that was quick. But then the receipts started coming in. By 2004, the Dulfer report confirmed it. Iraq had no active WMD program. None. Zero. The entire justification was built on a mirage. The consequences, though, were painfully real. Over 4,000 American troops killed. hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead, trillions of dollars burned. And in the chaos, extremist groups rose up, eventually birthing ISIS, a monster no one ordered but everyone had to deal with. America's reputation tanked. Instead of leader of the free world, people saw a trigger-happy superpower that launched a war on faulty intel. Bush wanted to be remembered as the man who kept America safe. But history keeps circling back to Iraq, a war that left scars everywhere except on the stockpile of weapons that never existed. As one journalist put it, the only thing America destroyed in Iraq was the world's trust in America. And with that, we've run the full gauntlet from John Adams to George W. Bush. 11 epic presidential faceplants. So there you have it, from John Adams all the way to George W. Bush. We've just ridden a roller coaster of presidential fails. Different men, different times, but the same painful truth. One signature, one rash decision can flip the fate of an entire nation. Looking back, 4 brutal lessons stand out. Power without responsibility equals disaster. Fear makes for terrible decision-making. Bad economic policy, the poor pay the price first. And once public trust collapses, the whole system wobbles. That's why history matters. Not to roast these guys forever, but to remind us these mistakes can't be repeated. Backhand index pointing right now, I want to hear from you. Out of these 11 epic fails, which one left the deepest scar on America? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to see your take. And remember, this is only half the story. Because alongside the faceplants, there were also jaw-dropping comebacks. Presidents who pulled off 180-degree turnarounds and turned disaster into triumph, with receipts to prove it. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and don't miss the next episode of our historical deep dive. See you on the next ride through history's blooper reel.